In the snow-covered forests of Colorado, a jet-black horse kneels before a dying child. No dialogue, only heartbeats and breath blending into the storm. It's not fantasy. It's the moment when two abandoned souls recognize each other. A single gaze like a mirror, reflecting the darkness within us, and the doorway back to life. Subscribe now to experience haunting emotional stories like this, only here. The wind screamed through the Rocky Mountains like a wounded beast, dragging coils of snow behind it, tearing at the pine trees that stood like sentinels in the dark. Each flake shimmered under the cold moonlight, slicing through the sky like shards of broken glass. The forest pulsed with an eerie kind of stillness, the kind that only arrives before something irreversible. The headlights of a battered white van cut a narrow path through the storm, flickering against branches weighed down with ice. Then suddenly the vehicle jerked to a halt on a narrow clearing, tires crunching against frozen gravel. The van idled breathless, like it knew what it was about to do. Inside, the heat hissed low, the only sound besides the wind. The woman in the driver's seat didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, lips pressed so tight they'd lost color. Her fingers were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. On the dashboard, tucked beside a half-burned sage bundle and a cracked amethyst crystal, sat a folded paper creased, stained with old coffee and stamped in red with a crude sun symbol. It was the Release of Darkness certificate. The price had been paid. The child was free. Noah sat in the passenger seat, bundled in a second-hand puffer jacket 2 sizes too big, his breath fogging the window beside him. He was 6, maybe a small 7. Too quiet. Too still. He held a paper talisman in his hand, a scrap of cloth twine tied around it, like a failed gift. His eyes, wide and dark, flicked to his mother, but said nothing. She finally turned to him. Her face was a battlefield, fear, conviction, guilt, and something else. Relief. The relief of a woman who had convinced herself this was mercy. Her hands trembled as she undid his seatbelt. "We don't belong here, baby," she said, voice like paper. "You'll go somewhere better, somewhere clean." Noah blinked. "Are we going home?" "We are," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "You just have a different road." She opened the door, and the cold swept in like a scream. Snow slapped against her face, sharp as sand. She winced, but climbed out, walking around to Noah's side. The forest yawned before them, dark, ancient, indifferent. She led him by the hand into the clearing, her boots sinking ankle deep. Her other hand clutched a small cloth satchel filled with quartz herbs and salt. Protection charms. Or so she had been told. When they reached the center of the clearing, she knelt before him. Her eyes searched his face desperately, as if trying to memorize every piece of it before the world swallowed him. "You're special," she choked. "That's why the shadows chased you. But they can't have you anymore. I won't let them." Noah's lips parted slightly. "I'm not scared." Her smile collapsed. Tears slid down her face, freezing against her cheeks. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, slow, long, trembling. Then she stood, took 3 steps back, and kept walking. "Noah," she called over her shoulder, voice swallowed by the storm. "Remember the light. Remember." The wind cut her off. She reached the van, climbed in, and the engine groaned to life. For a moment, the headlights framed the boy like a fallen statue, motionless, dusted with snow paper charm, fluttering between his fingers. Then she reversed, tires spinning, and the van disappeared into the trees. Silence. Noah didn't cry. His eyes tracked the red taillights as they faded through the thicket, a flicker of color swallowed by white. Then even the tire tracks vanished. Snow fell harder, faster, like the sky was erasing what had just happened. He looked down at the charm in his hand. The ink had started to blur. Far above, a single hawk circled once, before disappearing into the clouds. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, the frost, the absence. No one. He wrapped his arms around himself and sat. Still, like he'd done this before, like part of him already knew no one was coming back. Across the ridge 50 miles south, a building blinked with gentle amber light. It sat nestled among snow-dusted aspens, the kind of place designed to comfort, if only at a glance. The sign out front, hand-carved and weathered, read, "The Altar of Reclamation, a sanctuary for the broken." Inside, the warmth smelled manufactured cinnamon oil, pine-scented wax, faint incense. Wind chimes whispered at every doorway. Smiles came easy here. Too easy. A woman wearing a maroon shawl adjusted a small bronze statue on a shelf. Behind her, others in similar robes murmured as they poured herbal tea, adjusted tapestries, lit candles. Every room was a stage compassion, in soft lighting, purity, in cotton curtains, rebirth, in polished wood floors. In the central chamber, a man in a white tunic stood before a line of new initiates. Children, 6 in total. Ages varied. Some held plush toys. Others simply stood eyes hollow, shoulders drawn up like they were trying to disappear into themselves. The man raised his hands. Welcome, dear ones. You've been delivered from your chains. He walked down the line, slowly, kneeling before a girl with braids and wide brown eyes. You are not broken, he said, touching her forehead. You were never broken. The world told you lies. We will help you forget. The girl didn't respond. He moved to the next child. In a side room, a woman reviewed documents, all official-looking. Guardianship transfers, spiritual waivers, medical exemption forms signed under emotional clause. Some pages were smudged with fingerprints. One had a child's crayon scribble still faintly visible underneath the ink. She slid them into a folder labeled Noah E. Cleansed here. Back in the main hall, the man in white placed a crystal on each child's palm. These are your anchors, he said. They keep you tethered to the light. A boy in the back dropped his crystal. It cracked. The room went still for a beat. Then the man smiled. Not all light is gentle, he said softly. Sometimes it breaks before it heals. The boy was taken gently by the hand and led away. None of the children spoke. Not then. Not yet. Above them, a skylight framed the sky, storm clouds, brewing snow, tumbling like ash. The soundproof walls muted everything outside. The children never heard the wind. Back in the woods, Noah's hands had turned red. His breath slowed. His legs began to tremble, but he did not stand. He did not scream. He looked out at the trees with the gaze of someone far older than 6. Someone who'd understood the price of being different. A sudden movement behind the trees caught no one's attention but the ravens perched above. A shadow moved. Something large, graceful, black as obsidian. Then stillness. Noah blinked snow on his lashes, as if sensing something beyond comprehension. He didn't know the word for it, not yet. But something ancient had just seen him, and would not look away. The wind shrieked across the valley, like something ancient had awakened. Snow whipped through the branches in vicious spirals, blanketing the land in white rage. The barns creaked under the weight of the storm. Somewhere deep within the stables, unheeded, forgotten midnight stood still as a statue. Blacker than the shadows around her, muzzled, chained. Her breath was slow and hot vapor curling in thick coils from her nostrils. She had stopped eating 2 days ago. Hadn't allowed a hand near her since the last time the stable hand brought out the whip. She didn't flinch anymore. She simply stared, and then she moved. A sound, barely a whisper, threaded through the wind. Not human, not beast, not sound even. It came like a shiver across the air. A frequency only those who had known pain without words could feel. Midnight's ears twitched. Her head jerked to the side, eyes wide, suddenly alive. Something was calling. The chain at her halter trembled as she pulled against it once, twice, then snapped. The rusted metal clattered to the floor, and with one primal surge of muscle and fury, Midnight reared up, hooves shattering the stall gate like it was made of paper. Splinters flew. Another kick. The stable doors banged open in the gust. Snow invaded the space like an army. She bolted into the storm, past the empty fields, past the electrified fence no one thought a horse could clear. But Midnight was no ordinary horse. Her hooves barely touched the ground as she galloped through the snow-blind darkness, black against white, vanishing and reappearing in the wind like a phantom. Her mane lashed behind her like a flag of defiance. Her eyes, twin coals burning with something unnameable, searched ahead. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get there. She had been running for what felt like an hour or a moment. Time unraveled in the storm. The wind screamed past her ears, but something else pulled harder. That silence, that presence, that whisper beneath the noise that said, "There is something broken in the snow. Go to it." Her hooves hit an icy ridge. She skidded, twisted, corrected. The snow deepened, swallowing her legs halfway. She didn't stop. The trees thickened around her. Old pines bowed with the weight of winter, parted like curtains. The wind shifted. And then she saw it. A clearing, still, quiet, except a lump. At the base of a gnarled pine, half covered in snow. Barely taller than a stump. Midnight slowed. Breathing hard, clouds of steam rising from her flanks, she stepped forward. One hoof crunched into ice. Then another. Her nostrils flared. It wasn't a stump. It was small. It was human. And it wasn't moving. She took another step. The scent hit her, salt earth, sickness, sweetness, blood. Not fresh, but faint. And something colder than the wind. The child was alone. Midnight lowered her head. Her breath puffed across the boy's face, melting frost. His lips were tinged with blue. His eyelashes white. One hand still clutched a crumpled scrap of paper. "Noah." Midnight blinked once. And then her muscles seemed to drop all at once. She knelt slowly, carefully bending her front legs, first then lowering her body so that her flank pressed gently against the child's side. Her massive frame curled around him, enclosing him in a cocoon of heat and instinct. She had never done this before, not with any other creature. Not even her own foal, long since taken away. Noah didn't move. Midnight leaned in, her body trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper, rage and recognition, and something close to mourning. She nosed at the boy's face, licking the frost from his cheeks, nudging him until his body rolled ever so slightly toward her, his breath a whisper. But there, she stayed. The storm roared on, battering the forest, drowning everything in white. But the hollow beneath that tree, between the beast and the child, became sacred. A furnace born of shared abandonment. Each breath Midnight exhaled onto Noah's skin was a defiance of everything that had tried to unmake him. She shifted her weight slightly to block more wind. Her hooves tucked beneath her chest. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with his. She closed her eyes and listened to the snow, to his heartbeat, to something breaking and mending all at once. Far off, high above the trees, a flock of ravens turned sharply mid-flight, circling once, then twice, then diving east where fire once met frost. Back on the forest floor, a rabbit emerged from its burrow and paused, twitching its nose toward the clearing. It sensed something was wrong, but also somehow right. Somewhere in that storm, a balance had shifted. A dark shape cradled a smaller one. A black horse held the last warmth of a dying boy. Inside the cocoon of fur and ice and hope, Noah stirred. Not enough to wake. Just a twitch of fingers. A memory, maybe. Something primal. His hand moved slowly, unintentionally, brushing against Midnight's flank. Warm, alive. His lips parted. Not words, just air. His body, impossibly small, curled closer. Midnight did not react, but her ear flicked once. A movement, a vow. She would not leave him. Not again. Not like they'd left her. The storm would not ease for another 2 days. But in the dead of night, something like a heartbeat thrummed under the snow. It wasn't human. It wasn't equine. It was something shared, something old. The kind of connection no god could orchestrate and no devil could sever. Just the warmth of breath, just the weight of presence. Just two creatures cast out by those who claimed to love them, finding each other in the exact moment the world forgot them. Time passed without clocks. The forest became a cathedral of white silence, and Midnight became more than a horse. She became an ember, a sentinel, a promise. The dream didn't arrive like a whisper. It crashed, violent, drenched in white. Eli's body jerked under the weight of it, tangled in thick elk fur blankets inside the small cabin on the ridge. Sweat bled through his shirt despite the cold tracing lines down his temples and pooling in the hollow of his collarbone. He breathed like he was drowning, and the snow kept falling in his mind. He was standing in it, ankle-deep, barefoot, teeth chattering, though none of that made sense. Not the numbness in his hands, not the sound of something crying, not the fact that he wasn't alone. In front of him stood a horse. No, not just a horse. Midnight, towering, still. Eyes like polished obsidian slicked with sorrow. Her flank heaved with a breath, and in the gleam of stormlight, tears real. Impossible tears streamed down her long face, steaming as they struck the snow. Around her hooves, prints spiraled outward. Small ones, human, leading away, then stopping. Just stopping. And the horse did nothing but stare, not at Eli, at something beneath the snow. He tried to call out, but his voice vanished in the wind. The world began to shake, fracture, collapse in on itself. Then fire, then silence. Eli bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs, throat raw from a scream he never released. The room was dark, but warm. The fire hadn't died out. Its orange glow painted the walls in dancing light. Outside, the storm still clawed at the shutters. He could hear it like a presence pacing the porch. He clutched his chest and tried to steady his breathing. But it wasn't just a dream. He'd seen Midnight, her eyes, that broken sound in the wind, that place. It wasn't just some unconscious tangle of memory and fear. It was a calling. Footsteps creaked on the old pine floor. Eli turned his head slowly. His grandmother sat cross-legged by the hearth, as if she had been waiting for him to wake. Her silhouette was small, but steady. Wrinkled hands rested on her lap. The firelight brushed against the silver streaks in her braid. She didn't speak at first. She didn't have to. Eli sat up straighter, the sweat freezing on his skin. "She was crying," he said, voice low, hoarse. His grandmother turned slightly, her eyes catching the fire. "Ngukomkok," she said, slipping back into Lakota, her native tongue. "Chiki Tunlin bifut low. Horses don't cry, unless the spirits have been silenced." Eli swallowed. His hands trembled in his lap. He tried to place it what he was feeling. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was deeper, heavier, like a cord inside his chest had snapped. His grandmother reached for the cast-iron kettle above the flame. poured hot pine needle tea into a small worn clay mug, and set it on the low table without looking at him. "I saw her," he whispered. "I know. There was a child. I know." He flinched at her certainty. "How?" he asked, voice cracking. Her eyes finally met his. They were impossibly clear pale gray, like snow about to fall. "Because the wind changed. Because the birds didn't sing this morning. Because the dogs refused to leave the doorway. And because my bones are aching like they did the day your parents went into the river and didn't come back." Eli looked down. That ache had never really left. "What do I do?" he asked. She didn't blink. "You already know." The silence stretched between them. The fire popped. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the shutters, and somewhere in the forest, a long, low howl twisted through the dark. Eli stood. The motion was slow, deliberate, like his body already knew the answer, even if his mind hadn't caught up. He peeled off the sweat-soaked shirt and replaced it with a thick quilted jacket from the peg near the door. His boots were still damp from yesterday's hunting trip, but he shoved his feet into them without flinching. One glove had a hole in it. He didn't care. His grandmother watched him quietly. He moved to the hook above the door and took down the old flashlight. Tested it. Flickering, but alive. "Tell me where not to go," he said, voice steadier now. "Don't go west," she replied immediately. "Don't follow the broken creek bed. Stay clear of the hollow with the burnt cedar." He nodded. It was a game they'd played since he was little. When he wanted to do something dangerous, he'd ask where not to go. Her warnings were always coded instructions. Permission wrapped in reverse logic. He strapped the light to his coat, pulled a scarf over his mouth. His hand hovered on the door. "She's calling," he said again. His grandmother rose slowly, the way trees rise after winter. She stepped toward him, placed her wrinkled palm on his chest, over his heart. "Then don't let her wait," she said. Ely met her eyes, really met them, and something passed between them. Not approval, not fear. Something quieter. Grief. Pride. A shared knowing. He opened the door. Snow rushed in like a tide. He stepped into it. The cold punched his lungs. Ice stung his eyes. The wind slapped at him with open hands. But he didn't hesitate. The forest loomed ahead, vast and thick, unforgiving. The world was dark, but not silent. Eli listened, and in the distance, past the storm, past the logic of it all, he heard something that was not the wind, a heartbeat, and the faintest echo of a child's breath. The storm raged, like an exorcism above the tree line, clawing at the cliffs and choking the valley with a fury that erased even its own footprints. But down below, buried behind a wall of snow and stone, there was only silence. A hang carved centuries ago by wind and time opened like a broken mouth beneath a ledge of ice. The entrance was almost invisible now, half drowned in snowdrift. Frost grew like roots across the stone, and the cold sat thick in the air like breath held too long. Inside it was dark, but not dead. Midnight lay curled against the curved wall of the cave, her massive body pressed close to the child beside her. She had dug away the frost with her hooves, clawing at the ice, until the stone floor bled through. The ground was cold, but dry. It would do. Noah lay against her shoulder, his head resting just beneath her jawline. His body was too still, but not lifeless. The rise and fall of his chest was subtle, shallow. Almost like he wasn't there at all, like the world hadn't noticed him in days and was still deciding whether to allow him back in. Midnight's flank moved with her breath. Slow, deep, measured. She stayed perfectly still, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the small heartbeat pulsing near hers. Her eyes damp alert, Ancient stared into the dark. There were no words here, just the sound of wind screaming through the cracks in the rock. The distant groan of trees breaking beneath the weight of the snow. The shallow intake of breath from a boy who should have frozen hours ago. And the thrum of her heart. That sound so close to Noah's ear became his anchor. Thud, pause, thud, another pause. The rhythm never wavered, even when his breath did. Even when his small hands twitched in restless memory. Even when his mind, somewhere between waking and gone, slipped backward. He was back in the kitchen. Summer. The air buzzing with the soft hum of a broken fan. A window cracked open. Dust dancing in the sunbeam like tiny spirits. His mother stood at the counter stirring something in a chipped pot. She was humming. That same off-key tune she always sang when she was trying to feel like herself. Noah watched from the table legs swinging beneath his chair. His fingers played with the corner of the placemat, peeling it back, letting it snap forward again. He hesitated, then asked, voice barely above a whisper, "Am I bad?" The humming stopped. His mother turned. In the dream, her face was lit too perfectly, not real, too smooth, too soft. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, hands on his knees. "Why would you say that?" she asked. He shrugged. "You said I make the lights flicker, that I see things that aren't real." She smiled. Too wide, too slow. She pulled him into a hug, held him there longer than usual. "No, baby," she whispered. "You're just not made for this world. That's not bad. That's just complicated." Flash. She was sitting in a folding chair, a clipboard in her lap. Her signature scrawled across the bottom of a paper titled "Release of Dark Energies, Minor." The man beside her wore white, smiled with too many teeth, spoke softly like a bedtime story. "You're giving him a future," he said. She smiled back and nodded. The pen clicked closed. The dream ended. Noah shifted in his sleep. A whimper escaped his lips, a soft, broken sound that seemed too small to belong to anything still living. Midnight moved, not a full shift, just a slight tilt of her head, bringing her muzzle closer to his cheek. She pressed her nose gently against the boy's skin and breathed, then licked, once, slowly, as if washing away something no one else had dared to touch. A layer of ice on his eyelashes melted. His jaw relaxed. Her eyes glistened not from cold. She closed them, held the moment like breath. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, stillness reigned. A sanctuary built not of stone, but of presence. Midnight did not sleep. She stayed curled, her body curled protectively, her breath keeping time. And slowly, subtly, Noah's fingers, those tiny frost-nipped fingers, curled against her fur. She felt it, didn't move, didn't react. But inside, something cracked, not broken, not pain. Something older, like recognition, like memory, like the silent miracle of two survivors finding each other in the exact space the world had left to die, and somehow choosing to live. The cold bit deeper this high up. It chewed through wool, laughed at layers. But Eli kept going, pushing through waist-high snow, his breath jagged and loud in the silence of the trees. Every step was a fight. But it wasn't his body that hurt. It was something else. Something buried deeper than frostbite. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep going. The forest had stopped being forest hours ago. Now it was a cathedral of white and ice and silence. Every branch hung low, shoulders heavy with snow. The wind had gone quiet, as if it too was watching, listening. That's when he saw it. Tracks, not from the storm, not from yesterday, fresh. The shape of hooves, deep, clean, and smaller prints too, not animal, a child. Eli's breath caught. The snow in his lungs evaporated in a burst of fire. He followed, down a slope, across a frozen creek, around a jagged outcrop of granite. His boots slid caught, slid again. He didn't stop. The tracks curved around a rise in the rock and ended at a wall of snow. No, not a wall, a shadow, the mouth of a cave, barely visible, half buried in drift, but definitely there. And something he couldn't explain. It is something pulled at him from inside. He stepped forward, slowly. The air was different here, not warmer, but held, like time had stopped caring what happened outside. He crouched, brushing snow from the threshold, revealing dark stone beneath. His flashlight flickered, sputtered, then steadied. A shaft of natural light filtered down from a crack in the rock ceiling above, slicing across the cave floor in a beam of icy gold. That's when he saw them. Midnight and the boy. Eli froze. The image rooted him in place. The way the horse was curved around the child like armor made of muscle and instinct. The way the boy's head rested in the crook of her neck. The way the beam of light from above cut through the darkness, wrapping both of them in a soft, surreal halo. It looked biblical. It looked wrong to interrupt. He didn't enter. Instead, he knelt just outside, lowering himself into the snow like stepping into prayer. His gloved hand pressed into the frost. The cold shot up his arm, but he didn't flinch. He just looked. He wanted to cry. Not from sadness, from memory, from recognition. The boy wasn't moving much. But he was breathing. Barely. Eli could see at each slow rise of his small chest. And the horse watched him, eyes locked, unblinking, not hostile, not trusting either, just knowing there was a language between them, old and soundless. Eli held her gaze and whispered, not loud, not pleading, just a truth. "I got left too," he said. His voice trembled. He didn't care. "I waited on a sidewalk in Denver for 6 hours with a backpack full of toys. But nobody came. Cops found me eating salt from a pretzel wrapper." He paused. Snowflakes caught on his eyelashes. There was no horse. The silence after that was brutal, long, deafening. Midnight blinked once, then twice. Her muscles rippled slightly, not with fear, with something closer to breath. Then she shifted. Not a full retreat, not a surrender, but her body tilted, opened. Just enough. Her eyes didn't leave Eli's, but she moved her legs slow, deliberate, exposing the boy fully. Eli almost didn't move. The moment felt sacred, like touching it too fast might shatter it. But he knew what she was giving him. A choice, a trust, His hands moved like they were underwater slow reverent. He crawled forward inch by inch over the snow-packed cave floor. The boy's face came into full view. Pale, lips faintly blue, but eyes fluttering, breathing real. Eli's throat clenched. He reached out, slid his arms under the boy's small body. Noah whimpered, barely head rolling toward Midnight's chest. Midnight tensed, but didn't stop him. Eli held still, waited, then whispered, barely audible, "I'm not taking him. I'm helping him walk." The horse looked at him a moment longer. Then finally one slow, deep nod. Not human, but real. And Eli moved. He cradled the boy against his chest, one hand wrapping around the back of Noah's head, the other locking under his knees. Noah weighed nothing, just bones and silence, and almost. As Eli stood, Midnight leaned forward, her massive head pressed gently against Noah's side. One last breath. A farewell. Eli didn't speak, didn't promise anything. He just met her eyes one last time and turned. Snow poured into the cave behind him as he stepped back into the storm. The wind hit harder now, angrier. But Eli didn't feel it. He had a child in his arms and a fire in his chest. The cabin smelled of cedar-boiled pine needles and something older, like memory baked into the wood. It was warm, but not gentle, not soft. The kind of warmth that scraped you clean before it healed you. Noah lay on the pallet near the hearth, layered in wool, surrounded by silence. His skin was pallid cheeks, sunken lips tinged a bruised blue. His tiny fists were curled tight against his chest, like he was still bracing against the cold, even in the heat. Grandmother moved slowly around him, bare feet silent on the worn wooden floor. Her hands wrinkled, but steady, carried the weight of 1,000 quiet salvations. She hummed as she worked. Not a lullaby, a chant. Something without words, older than English, older than even her mother's language. It vibrated through the walls like bone song. Steam rose from the iron pot on the stove, a mix of bare root wild mint and mountain tobacco. She crushed herbs with her thumb, mixed powders into salves, ladled broth into a ceramic cup worn smooth from decades of use. She sat beside the boy and pressed a cloth to his forehead, soaked in snowmelt and mullein. Noah twitched. Didn't wake. She kept singing. Outside, Eli stood on the porch, staring out at the narrow trail that led down the mountain. Snow crunched under his boots. The storm had passed, but the air still felt wrong, like it hadn't decided whether to calm or rage again. That's when he saw the SUV headlights slicing through the trees. 3 of them, black, federal. He cursed under his breath and turned to the door. But before he could step inside, Grandmother was already there. She didn't speak, just looked at him with those pale eyes and shook her head once. "No." "But no," she said again, firmer. He took a step forward, voice low and tight. "They're gonna ask. He's a missing kid. He needs..." She raised one hand, not to strike, to remind. Not every wound belongs to a hospital, Eli. Not every healing begins with a clipboard. He looked past her toward Noah. The boy was so small. Too small. He didn't belong in any of this. "They'll take him," Eli whispered. "They'll lose him," she corrected. The tires crunched closer. Doors slammed. Voices echoed firm, official knowing. Eli's hands balled into fists. "Let me just talk to them," he said. "Just stall." She nodded, slowly, handed him a carved talisman, and closed the door behind him. The agents were dressed in stormproof gear, but their eyes were too clean. They looked around like the world owed them clarity. One of them was holding a printed photo, Noah's school picture. The smile didn't match the boy in the cabin. Not even close. "We got a tip," the late agent said, "about a child seen near Raven Pass." Eli didn't lie, but he didn't give truth away like candy either. He told them the storm had scattered everything, that any tracks would have been erased by now, that no child would have survived out here, not unless they had a miracle. The agents glanced at each other. One looked past Eli toward the cabin. Eli stepped in front of his line of sight. "You need a warrant to go in there." The man raised an eyebrow. "You 17 yet?" "Old enough to know when the system loses people." That landed. The agent's jaw clenched. Eli didn't blink. Finally, the man sighed. "We'll be back." "I know," Eli said. They left in silence. Eli stood in the cold until their taillights vanished. Then he went inside. The fire was lower now, the room dim. Grandmother had retreated to her chair, eyes closed, fingers running along a beaded necklace, whispering to someone Eli couldn't see. Noah was still unconscious, but breathing easier. Eli dropped to his knees beside the boy. He didn't speak at first, just watched him. So small, so breakable, so familiar. His own memories rose like blood to the surface. The shelter, concrete floors that always smelled like bleach and urine. Fluorescent lights that never turned off. The counselor who called the kids resets, as if people could be formatted and restarted. Eli had been 12 when they locked him in solitary for screaming too loud during a panic attack. He had clawed at the walls for hours, No one came. No horse came. Just silence. And after that, running. Through alleyways, bus stations, forests. Until one day, a woman with white eyes and quiet hands found him sleeping inside a broken woodshed and didn't call anyone, just sat beside him and waited until he woke. Now he looked at Noah, barely alive, barely real, and he reached forward, took the boy's hand, held it tight. "You're not a ghost," he whispered. "And you're not some dirty thing they threw away. You're not something to trade for a better life or a cleaner name." Noah's eyelids fluttered. Eli leaned closer. "You're not what they said you were." A tear slipped from his eye, tracing a clean line down a dirty cheek. "You're not a thing, Noah." His voice cracked. "You're a boy." He squeezed the small hand harder. "You're a boy, and you get to grow up." Outside, the wind shifted again, but inside something began to warm. Something buried. Something alive. The building loomed against the snowy hill like a lie that had learned how to breathe. It was beautiful on the outside. Clean white siding, polished stone steps, hand-carved signs that read, "The Altar of Reclamation, where healing begins." There were dream catchers in every window, candlelight behind stained glass, and a slow, meditative hum playing just low enough for the bones to feel it. But Eli had been inside once before, and he knew better. Now, crouched in the shadows behind the maintenance shed, he waited. The darkness was on his side this time. He'd timed it right dinner hour, the moment the staff loosened their masks and pretended to be kind. He wore black from head to toe, not because it made him invisible, but because he didn't want to carry any color from this place back with him. He slipped through the side entrance using the key card he'd swiped months ago when he'd first pretended to volunteer here. They always welcomed good indigenous boys, used their presence like a badge. The door clicked shut behind him. Inside, the light changed. Not warm, white-blue. Too perfect. Too sterile. The kind of light that erases softness. That makes wounds look like sins. The hallway was empty. No footsteps. No voices. Only the soft hiss of hidden vents and the echo of Eli's breath in his chest. He moved fast, but careful, sliding along the corridor toward the treatment wing. The last time he'd been here, they'd told him the children were resting. He'd seen the locks on the outside of the doors. Now the locks were still there. He stopped at the third door on the left. Metal. No window. Just a vent. He knelt, pressed his ear to the lower corner. Nothing. Then scratching. A shuffle. A muffled sob. Eli's jaw tightened. He moved on, room after room, same story, until he reached the last one. This door had a slit at eye level. He stood on tiptoes and looked through. Inside, a girl sat cross-legged on the floor, hands bound behind her back, duct tape over her mouth. She was maybe 7. She saw him instantly, like she'd been waiting. Their eyes locked. She didn't move, didn't cry, just watched. He raised one finger to his lips, then held up a small stone in his other hand, smoothed from the river near his grandmother's cabin. A protection charm. She blinked once. Slowly, he slipped the stone under the door. Then he turned and ran. Across the valley, in the old ranger station, now converted into an incident command post. Eli's grandmother sat across from 2 federal agents, her palms laid flat on the table like maps. In front of her, documents, recordings, photos, a USB drive. The air between them was electric. "This is trafficking under the disguise of spiritual cleansing," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She had seen too much to shake. "They coerce the parents. Use language like soul freedom and purification to sign over custody. They call the children transitional vessels." She slid a page across the table. A legal release form, signed, stamped, with a price attached. One of the agents swallowed hard. "These people," she continued, "are laundering trauma into salvation and calling it healing." "It is neither." The second agent nodded slowly. "We've suspected, but no one ever came forward." "I'm not just coming forward," she said. "I'm kicking the door down." That door shattered at 11:03 p.m. Spotlights cut through the snow, red and blue, washing over the forest. The compound flared to life in chaos. Alarms, shouts, heavy boots, helicopter rotors churned the silence into dust. "Federal agents, come out with your hands up." Children screamed inside. Doors cracked. Rooms burst open. Eli watched from behind the tree line, breath caught in his chest. One by one, the kids were let out. Some barefoot, some blindfolded, some held each other like glue. That little girl, she was one of the first, still clutching the river stone. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked back once toward the building behind her, and then forward, toward the dark trees, toward freedom. The smoke rose in thin spirals into the branches of the ancient pines, drifting like ghosts above the circle of firelight. The air was hushed, but not with silence, with reverence. The snow had been cleared in a wide ring, and the bare earth steamed slightly from the heat of the flames, as if the forest itself was exhaling. The children stood close together, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, not quite sure if they were dreaming. Some held hands. Others just stood trembling, watching the fire like it might swallow them or save them. Around them, elders moved with a solemn kind of grace. They lit bundles of sweetgrass and cedar, circled the children whispering blessings in Lakota, Navajo, Cheyenne. Languages that had survived centuries of erasure, now rising again, not to command, but to protect. Eli knelt in the circle, head bowed, palm pressed flat to the ground. And next to him sat Midnight. The fire danced across her coat, turning black into obsidian, her breath visible in slow, steady bursts. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just watched. As if she too understood this was not ceremony, it was repair. A woman with a braid down to her waist stepped forward, lifted her hands skyward, and chanted a name not spoken aloud before. Noah. The boy lay wrapped in furs near the fire's edge, still pale but warmer now. A small shape returned from the edge of winter. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. No one spoke, not even the wind. Noah blinked slowly, like his soul was catching up to his body. He turned his head, scanned the fire, the people, the shadows between trees. Then he saw her. Midnight. She didn't move, but Noah reached out with one trembling hand and touched the air like he was trying to remember what fur felt like. Eli shifted closer. Didn't speak. Just moved the furs aside enough for Noah to see what lay beyond them. Midnight lowered her head. Noah's fingers brushed the space just beneath her throat, where the fur was warmest. She leaned into it. It wasn't a reunion. It was a continuation. Miles away, in a concrete cell that smelled of rust and antiseptic. A woman sat cross-legged on a thin mattress, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were open, but they didn't see the room. The fluorescent lights flickered. She didn't notice. She whispered something under her breath, over and over. A chant. A mantra. Her voice was steady, detached, like someone reading a script they no longer understood. I freed him from the dark. I freed him from the dark. I freed him. She had not asked for a lawyer. She had not cried. She believed the rituals had worked, that the vanishing was salvation, that the boy, wherever he was, had become light. They had taken her picture, printed her name, filed her as unfit, unstable, deeply manipulated. But no one had asked what had broken first, what had made her believe that deliverance had to look like abandonment. Now she sat in silence, the kind that grows inside you after your God stops answering. Back in the forest, the fire was beginning to die. The last chant was sung, the last ember offered. The children were led to the warming tents, escorted 2 by 2 by elders, who wrapped their arms around shoulders still too small for the things they'd carried. But Eli stayed behind. So did Midnight. He sat on the edge of the ring, staring into the black between the trees. The fire's glow lit one half of his face. The other half faded into night. He didn't notice the cold anymore. Midnight moved beside him and stopped. She turned her head slow, deliberate, and looked not at the fire, but at him. Her eyes reflected everything. The flames, the sky, the boy asleep behind them, the trees above. And Eli, he stared back. In her eyes, he saw himself, not as he wished to be, but as he truly was. Strong, split, still healing, still here. Snow blanketed the land like a fresh page. Not clean exactly, but quiet. Open. The kind of quiet that makes you believe something new might happen. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting everything in a soft gold that didn't give much warmth, but still managed to reach inside you. The community had gathered that morning not for ceremony, not for spectacle, but simply to begin again. Noah stood beside Eli near the tree line, clutching a carved wooden bird in his mittened hand. He didn't speak. He hadn't said much since the fire circle that night. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't have to. Here no one asked about the mother. No one whispered about the healing center. No one offered condolences soaked in curiosity. They offered him space, offered him names in their language, not to replace his own, but to remind him that he wasn't untethered anymore. They gave him brothers, sisters, elders who called him child of the cold, come back warm, and food he didn't have to earn. He was not a project. He was not a survivor. He was a boy, and this was his new soil. Most days he wandered the edge of the woods with Eli, learning the paths of deer, the difference between hawk call and raven cry, the way the snow spoke beneath your feet if you listened long enough. They built shelters out of bark and pine, learned to boil roots until the bitterness softened. He watched as Eli sketched symbols in the dirt, teaching him language without needing to write it down. Noah never mentioned Midnight. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew. The horse stayed nearby, never far, but never close enough to be claimed. She wandered through the hills like shadow and thunder, her hooves silent in the snow. People gave her space, called her by name, but no one approached. Not even Eli. One elder said she was the line between storm and stillness. Another simply called her the one who waits. Then one morning after a night of deep snow, Noah rose before the others. The air was sharp, breath-stealing, the sky just beginning to bruise with dawn. He padded across the clearing in his boots, tugging on his coat without zipping it, moving like he was following something just out of frame. Midnight was already there. She stood near the edge of the tree line, her body still but alert, as if she'd known he was coming. Her coat shimmered against the snow, steam rising off her flanks, like she carried summer inside her. Noah didn't speak, didn't move fast. He just walked, stopped 3 feet in front of her. The wind held its breath. Midnight blinked once, then knelt. No commands, no gestures, just the slow, impossible movement of a wild thing, folding itself into submission, not out of fear, not out of training, but something closer to recognition. The silence was complete. Noah stepped forward, placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch, and he climbed. There was no saddle, no reins, just a boy and a beast, and the snow between them. She stood, one motion, fluid, natural, the kind of motion you only get from 2 bodies learning to carry each other. She began to walk, hooves pressing into untouched snow, carving a line where no one had dared go. Noah sat upright, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes wide open. No music, no applause, only the sound of snow shifting beneath them, only the sound of movement. Together, the trees parted. The world widened. Midnight moved through the forest with purpose, not rushing, not meandering. She followed a trail only she knew. Maybe it didn't matter where they went. Maybe the going was enough. Behind them, faint tracks slowly began to vanish under new snowfall, as if the earth itself was choosing to forget the wounds and remember only the walk. And in that silence, in that white and that gold and that hush, something happened. Not a miracle, not a transformation, just a boy being lifted, higher than his feet had ever taken him, farther than pain could follow. The snow was hard beneath them, packed down by wind and time, but neither of them moved. Eli sat cross-legged on the edge of the bluff, elbows resting on his knees, breath curling into the morning air. Beside him, Noah was perched close, small hands braced on the ground, his eyes locked on the valley below, a wide, undisturbed sea of white stretching into the horizon. The wind tugged gently at their jackets, but it wasn't cruel. It was just present. Behind them, the forest held its breath. Ahead of them, the world waited. Noah leaned forward a little, peering over the edge. The drop wasn't steep, but it was far enough to make his fingers clench the snow a bit tighter. He didn't say anything for a while. Just watched the quiet, as if waiting for it to speak first. Eli turned his head and studied him. "You scared?" he asked, voice low but kind. Noah didn't look away from the valley. He nodded, then added softly, "But midnight's not." Eli smiled just barely. He tilted his head toward the boy. "That why you came up here?" Noah shrugged. "I wanted to see what she sees." They sat with that a moment. Not in silence, because even silence has texture, but in something more honest, like a truth too old for words. The sun crested the trees, then shooting gold across the snow, casting their shadows long and thin behind them. Eli shifted his weight and looked out again. The light struck his eyes, and for a moment Noah turned to look. He blinked, then whispered, "Your eyes look like hers." Eli chuckled under his breath. "Midnights." Noah nodded. "When the light hits right, it's like looking into the same thing." Eli squinted. "What do you see?" Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his knees up to his chest and hugged them, thinking carefully, not like a child fumbling for words, but like someone afraid to say something that might undo the moment. Then he said, "It's like a mirror. Not just my face, but how I feel inside." Eli stilled. He hadn't expected that. Noah continued softer now. "Sometimes I don't know what I am, but when I look in her eyes, it's like she knows already. And it's okay." The words hit like a tide breaking over stone. Eli looked down at his hands, rubbed his palms against his jeans, and drew a shaky breath. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "I used to stare into mirrors and not see anything." Noah looked at him. I mean, there was a face, sure, but nothing behind it. Just space. Like the person in there left a long time ago. Eli touched his chest, the spot over his heart. Not dramatic, just honest. There were days I thought I'd never find him again. The person I used to be. Before they broke me into parts. Noah didn't speak, just watched. Eli glanced sideways, saw the boy's gaze steady and focused, not pitying, not afraid. Just with him. So he kept going. "You ever see a lake so still, it looks like glass?" Noah nodded. "When you're broken," Eli said, "it's like someone threw a rock in that lake. Not once. Over and over. And you keep trying to see yourself again. But the water never settles. You just see ripples. Pieces." He paused, then added, "Midnight, she's like that lake before the stones." They both looked out over the valley again. The wind picked up slightly, brushing snow from the cliff's edge, revealing rock beneath. Noah turned, looked Eli straight in the face, and asked, "What if someone throws another rock?" Eli blinked, then smiled. "Then you wait." Noah tilted his head. "You wait until it stops, until the water's calm again. And if it doesn't, you learn to breathe underwater." Noah considered that, then leaned his head gently against Eli's arm. They sat like that, as the sun climbed higher, casting more light across the valley, light that caught the snow refracting through it, making it shimmer like stars had come down to sleep. In the distance at the tree line, Midnight stood watching, still, unmoving, but her eyes reflected them both. And in her eyes, neither of them looked broken. Midnight's haven, for those still becoming. The building wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Just wide wooden beams, warm walls, big windows, and doors that never locked. The paddock stretched out behind it, dotted with rescue horses in various states of healing, limping, running, resting. There was no front desk, just a circle of chairs and the smell of sage and soil. It had been 1 year, exactly, since that night in the snow, since the cave, since the fire. The land had changed. Not in shape, but in rhythm. The community had come together with quiet precision. Woodworkers, retired teachers, young people with memories they hadn't yet learned to name. No fundraisers, no headlines. Just work, just wood, just breath. It wasn't a shelter, it was a promise. And that morning, Eli walked the gravel path from the barn to the paddock, a bag of apples slung over his shoulder, his boots muddy and a clipboard tucked under one arm. He stopped halfway, stared across the open field. Noah stood beside the fence, brushing the neck of a chestnut mare with a scar down her side. His hands moved with care, slow and sure. He was taller now, still quiet, but his silence had changed. Not hiding, just full. "New arrival just came in," Eli called out. Noah turned, pushed his hair back with the side of his wrist, and nodded. "Scared?" he asked. Eli gave a small laugh. "Of course. Most are." They walked back toward the house. Inside, a group of volunteers were setting up the riding ring, adjusting straps, cleaning tack, sweeping sawdust. Laughter floated through the barn walls. Music played faintly from a battered speaker in the corner. In one of the side rooms, small and warmly lit, sat a boy, no more than 5. He was curled into himself in the far corner, wrapped in an oversized coat, eyes darting toward every new movement. One knee was bruised, one shoelace missing. He didn't speak, didn't even blink much, just watched. Eli stood in the doorway and didn't approach. He'd learned not to crowd the silence. Noah stood beside him. The boy looked up, startled. Noah didn't smile, didn't speak. He just nodded once, then turned and walked out toward the barn. 10 minutes later, the world held its breath. Midnight appeared. No one had told her. No one had led her. She just knew. She walked calmly across the yard, through the open gate down the hallway, lined with windows' hooves silent against the wood. She stopped just outside the doorway and looked in. The boy gasped just slightly but didn't move. Midnight lowered her head. Slow, measured, then knelt. Right there in the doorway, legs folding with the weight of the unspoken. The boy's breathing changed. His fingers twitched. He inched forward, one motion at a time. No words, no coaxing. He placed a small hand, uncertain, shaking against Midnight's shoulder. She didn't move, but the boy did. His face turned, and for the first time his eyes lifted. The fear was still there, but something else broke through. Recognition. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Just a breath, like the first one after nearly drowning. Behind the glass, Noah watched. Eli stood beside him. Neither said anything. They didn't have to. The boy leaned his forehead against Midnight's neck, and his whole body softened like the storm had finally passed. Later that night, the sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the field. Children sat in a circle near the fire pit, roasting bread on sticks, trading stories and secrets. Some laughed. Some cried. Most did both. Noah knelt by the trough, refilling buckets when the boy appeared beside him. He didn't speak, just knelt too, and helped. Eli walked along the fence line, looking out at the horses, at the kids, at the stars creeping into the sky. His voice rose, not loud. "But sure, we don't get to erase the dark. But we can learn to look into it as long as someone's looking back." Midnight stood at the edge of the field watching, always watching, and her eyes reflected everything.